This is episode 579 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Jim Winchester. He is executive director of the Independent Petroleum Association of New Mexico, IPANM. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Jim.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, and obviously, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule. There's a lot of bills pertaining to oil and gas, generally to the point of attacking them in the legislature. But before we get into exactly what's going on, can you talk briefly about yourself and the role you play and your organization plays within the oil and gas industry and representing them?
Sure. Thanks much, Paul, again. Yeah. I have been here on and off in the state of New Mexico for 15 years now. And my background is such that I worked for 13 years in broadcast television. But on top of that, I've got a mechanical engineering degree. So very diverse background. But what eventually led me into oil and gas and to representing small producers at the Independent Petroleum Association of New Mexico was the exposure and the opportunity I had to work under Governor Martinez in the Oil Conservation Division. And it was really a good 4-year stint of oil and gas 101 for a guy from the Midwest who did not grow up around this and really evolved into a passion. I think there's aspects of the extraction that I really enjoy as a mechanical engineer, but also certainly the ability to step onto the playing field and communicate all the wonderful things that oil and gas does for the state of New Mexico is something that I truly enjoy and something I truly believe in. So all of that has led to this position. I'm in my 7th year now at IPANM. And for those who aren't familiar, we represent smaller oil and gas producers. I sort of affectionately call us little oil as opposed to big oil. But we have a lot of members in the state of New Mexico specifically who are part of multi-generational operations and have been involved in oil and gas now for 60, 70 years. And we're seeing, in fact, some of our members being run now by third generation. So these are the folks that live and work in the communities and have a passion for this industry. They have a passion for environmental protection and doing things the right way. And those are the exact sort of members that I'm proud to represent.
Excellent. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the nuanced differences between their takes, the two groups' takes on some of the issues. But let's kind of start out with a thesis before we dive into some of the bills. And we've specifically sat in committee together on HB 41, the Clean Fuel Standard, this session, and we talk about that for sure. But there's a lot of other bills related to oil and gas. So this session, even though it's a 30-day session, typically relating to budgets, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the industry that funds New Mexico to such a great extent is being attacked in ways that we quite frankly haven't seen. Certainly during the Lujan Grisham administration, there's been more antipathy towards the industry, ironic because of the amount of revenue that you guys are producing. But this session seems to be a particularly impactful session in terms of bills introduced. Maybe not passed. We're still, as we have this conversation, we're about midway through the session. But am I wrong in feeling like the industry is being taken on more directly by the legislature than it has been even in recent years?
Yes, correct. And I would say, as much as by the legislature, which, as you know, has gone very progressive and very anti-oil and gas, we've seen a lot of this coming from the governor's office. Now, let me preface that by saying that, Governor Lujan Grisham it has at times worked well with industry. At other times, we, and probably more times than not, have been on the other side of the table on a lot of legislation and policy changes that we've seen going on over the past 5 years since she's gotten into office. This session in particular, I think there's some reasons as to why immediately out of the gate we saw what I'd like to call as a full frontal assault on our industry, and specifically disproportionately attacking the small producers. So what we saw last year was a group of environmental groups file a major lawsuit against the governor, against the legislature, and against a lot of the boards and commissions in the environmental departments for a claim that they are not enforcing the existing regulations to the fullest extent, but furthermore, not having enough rules on the books to enforce oil and gas industry. I find that somewhat of a insincere argument, since the Lujan Grisham administration has spent several years here proclaiming that they have now passed the most stringent regulatory bills on industry in the country. That includes a pair of methane rules that came down within the last few years. So essentially, what's happened is that they've ratcheted up, they being the environmental groups, ratcheted up pressure on the administration and legislators to do more. When in fact, I think we can make the argument that in addition to improvements that we've seen over the last couple of years in environmental protection, they're actually doing more than is even necessary. So with that lawsuit, we sort of anticipated this 30-day session being fast and furious, and that's what we've seen. We've seen sort of a shotgun approach to a lot of different legislation that is attacking certain facets of the industry, and if passed, would certainly have a major impact on the ability for this industry to continue to flourish within the state, and certainly provide the revenues that are the backbone. As you mentioned, 50% of the state revenue coming from our industry last year, the backbone of those revenues that go to everything from schools to police to even environmental protection. So yes, out of the gate, it has been a real challenge to try to slow down some of these bills that, if they get through, will hurt us.
And you talk about small oil versus big oil, and there's obviously a role in this world and in this state for both of them. Do you have any data or information about what percentage of the oil and gas industry in New Mexico, in terms of, say, production, is big oil versus small oil? So how important this small subgroup, smaller subgroup of producers is relative to the overall production figures?
Sure. So first thing I want to say as a preface is that we are all in this industry together, and our friends who are in the majors are truly our friends. So I don't want to have this sort of escalate into the smalls versus the bigs. But in terms of just the stats that sort of lay out the differences, the larger oil companies, some of them are multinational super majors like the Exxons and the Chevrons and others that we know and see, along with some very large independents. I would say there's the top 15 producers in the state of New Mexico would account for 80 to 85% of all production that's coming out of the state. Now, if you consider the fact that there are some 600 registered producers in New Mexico, that by simple math means that 580 some producers that are out there are generating a lot smaller quantities of oil and gas. But what's not seen in that stat is that a lot of these companies employ a lot of people who live and work right here in New Mexico, and that is sort of the engine and the backbone of the economy for a lot of communities, as well as the state in general. So when we see rules coming out and we see new regulations coming out, the majors with their bigger pockets can financially afford to make changes quicker, as opposed to the smallers, where they have to find ways to finance dramatic changes that in some cases costs exceeding the point of them being able to maintain their operations and do business. So, and I will also say that, 15% of production from the small producers is not insignificant. And that adds up and is a significant portion of that 50% of the revenue that we support. So it's my job to represent those small producers and make sure that the playing field competitively is even within the industry, and to make sure that the government is not overreaching in those rules and regulations.
Now, and I understand your desire to maintain a united front, but I'm going to ask this question anyway because you know any free market economist looks at regulation and they understand that regulations tend to most negatively impact smaller players. For example, in the area of the minimum wage or issues like paid leave or paid sick leave, and we've seen these all in Santa Fe in recent years. It's the mom and pop small restaurants that pay the price, small businesses that are impacted by these regulations. Just as a matter of fact, it would seem that not only executive regulations like the methane rule and others, but also proposals to increase regulations through the legislative process. Those just by their nature are going to have a disproportionate impact on the independents and smaller producers. Am I wrong in that statement?
No, you're exactly correct. And we can get into some examples of current legislation that's being bunted around right now in Santa Fe. Specifically, there is a bill, HB 133, which looks to what they are calling modernize the Oil and Gas Act. And there are certain elements that the administration is claiming and that environmentalists are claiming that need to be quote unquote updated. And their way of updating it, for example, in the area of this is just one facet of it, financial assurance bonding, which is a bond that an operator puts down and is held by the state in order to ensure that when the life of that well is over, there's money there to clean it up. And what we're seeing now, for what the proposals are to increase those bonds across the board, takes what is at the highest tier a $250,000 bond and raises that to $10 million. So
What's the bill number on that? Just since we're
HB 133.
okay, now that was so this is opening up the Oil and Gas Act, which if you could just briefly describe what that act is, since we're diving into the specifics
Sure.
of the bill. But you know, this was originally also a much more ambitious piece of legislation. Not saying it's good, but if you could just
Yeah,
outline
yeah.
what the Oil and Gas Act is and how HB 133 has already evolved, because this is, to my knowledge, again, the first piece of legislation that has directly attempted to open up the fundamental regulations surrounding oil and gas in New Mexico.
Correct. So the New Mexico Oil and Gas Act is what's written in state statute as the provisions that the Oil Conservation Division of New Mexico then abides by in terms of its regulation of industry. Over the years, rules have been adopted at the administrative level to keep up with the times and to change some of the parameters of that. When you get to the point where you're pushing through legislation, they're looking for a lack of, well, I mean, just to use vernacular, to take a bulldozer through what is in state statute and sort of rearrange and reformulate what the priorities are and how they're going to regulate that. So that is what this bill does, and that is why this bill is receiving a lot of media attention. And I think the scope of it, as you mentioned, is narrowing, but it's still an enormous, monstrous bill, 40 plus pages of regulations that we feel are attempting to be pushed through a 30-day session without a significant look at the impacts on all levels of the state. And as I was mentioning, for example, one element of this is financial assurance, and the disproportionate number, as I mentioned, from 250,000 to 10 million. Well, a major can handle that, but a small company can't. Other elements in this bill at one point included mandatory setbacks of a half mile around well sites. And that would have, if it had maintained and stayed in the bill, essentially cut off 60% of the land that's available to develop up in the San Juan Basin, and maybe 20% of the land down in the Permian. So these are big chunks of land that we already have proven that we can safely produce within certain areas of residential zones. So it's an all-encompassing major bill that we are making our case as it goes through the legislature. That boy, I'll tell you, if you take this radical and this dramatic of a change, you're going to reshape the industry to a point where we're going to get down to about 5 super majors who do not live in the state and are running the whole show. And we're seeing this sort of consolidation going on across the country right now. And I would argue that it's not good for competitive business, and in the long run would hurt the consumer. So that's what we're up against in this particular bill.
Now, I know there was another bill relating to regulations of oil and gas facilities within a mile diameter of schools. That was HB 32. Now, because it is a 30-day session, I think that one was not considered germane. But I, just on my own, because we track all these bills, and I've seen and been and stayed with people who live not within a mile, but within a few hundred yards or so of oil and gas wells. And I've spent a lot of time around them, both in the Four Corners as well as southeast New Mexico. And I've not seen a single study, and this pertains to the land commissioner and her regulations as well, that she's putting a perimeter around these facilities. Is there research that shows that there are serious health concerns with regard to being in proximity to these facilities? I found another report about Beverly Hills High School in California, one of the wealthiest high schools in the entire country, had a oil well within the high school, and it operated for decades, and there was never any proof that there was health issues for these uber rich kids living in Beverly Hills, California. So, talk about that setback issue and any science relating to it one way or the other.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because a lot of times this sort of discussion gets thrown across the media and misunderstood. As far as studies are concerned related to setbacks, there are dozens of studies out there that claim that there are health impacts to degrees that frankly can't be substantiated. And if you look at the fine print of those studies, they're funded by environmental activist groups. So for every study that is out there, you need to have a better context to understand what kind of science we're dealing with. The state of Colorado, to sort of counter this, did their own study a couple years ago and showed that existing setbacks around municipalities as close as 300 to 500 feet were plenty, and that there was zero impact on health from emissions or anything else surrounding that well site. You mentioned some municipalities that have grandfathered in and already have existing wells. This is going on as it stands right now with wells up in Farmington. And the community there is more than comfortable, and in fact knows and understands and welcomes what those wells do provide in terms of benefits to the local economy. So this is by no means a new issue, but it's being amplified and sort of feeding into the fear culture that somehow every single oil and gas well that's out there exists to pollute, which is a fallacy. And so it's unfortunate that we've gotten to this point. Environmental groups have a lot of sway, and certainly have the ear of legislators in this state as well as the governor's office. And that fear factor, I think, is driving a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating to see just a lack of basic information being presented to justify what would be a very costly piece of legislation and regulation were it to uh, be enacted. But that's kind of the way we're seeing things go up in Santa Fe. So there's a lot of other bills. One of the ones, like I mentioned, HB 41, the Clean Fuel Standard. Can you share a little bit about that particular issue? And, also, there's tax credits included in that and how, just what those would do. But talk, because the Clean Fuel Standard has been discussed in various forms in recent years, rejected, obviously on a bipartisan basis. But this one, it seems to me that they keep making it more and more vague and providing fewer and fewer details. So they're trying to ram it through by essentially pawning the decision off of the Environmental Improvement Board.
Yeah, I think again, this is another one coming out of the chute in the session that is a lot of push behind it, specifically by the governor's office. And again, let's go back to why this is all happening in conjunction with other bills at the same time in this 30-day session. There is a linkage between this and that lawsuit that I talked about earlier. So they are aggressively pushing through a lot of this legislation, and we've seen this one before, the clean fuel standards, which is, while it sounds very simple, like they will be adopting a new fuel blend, which then will cost more to operate and make, and then that gets passed along down to the consumers, is it's a lot more convoluted than even that. We're talking about um, creating an entire new market and they haven't even named it, but let's call them clean fuel credits. And if you always follow the money, you can sort of see where this is coming from. The motivation, I think, what what you could, in simplest terms, say is that um, these credits out there, in some way, uh, give larger companies the incentive to monetize uh, this entire new market of credits in exchange for, unfortunately, putting the burden of increased fuel costs on the backs of the taxpayer. So someone always has to pay for it, and someone else always wins from it. So they've thrown in this tax credit into what is a clean fuel standards bill by name, but it's sort of a bait and switch, for lack of a better word. And unfortunately, if it does go through, my fear and the fear of the small producers is that the costs will be borne by the folks who fuel up the gas pump. And then when you see that, and an increase in studies that have shown that that has happened, like in Oregon and other states, what you see then is that it's disproportionately hurting those who live in rural areas, who have to travel further, and frankly, those who live in poverty, who that is their means of traveling, and they get hit the hardest. So that's why we are opposed to this bill. There are a lot of groups, businesses, rural. It's almost coming down to rural versus city. Um, that we get into these discussions and these arguments, and this is the fifth year, as you mentioned, that this bill has been up before for discussion. So where it's headed, I don't know, but I certainly think that consumers need to be aware that this is not a good thing.
Yeah, and again, we both testified against this in two separate committees, House Environment Committee, and then the Judiciary Committee. It's now soon to be voted on the House floor. Um, Again, it's revised. It is harder to exactly understand what they plan to do with it because, yet again, they're pushing this regulatory process off on the Environmental Improvement Board, which just, having dealt with them during the EV mandate issue back in November, the Environmental Improvement Board is not a regulatory body. It's not equipped for this kind of regulatory process making. It doesn't.
Right.
It's not a good way to do it, but uh, they don't want to have their fingerprints on it in the legislature, saying we're going to do ethanol, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and it's going to cost all that much because the FIR, the fiscal impact report, would uh, throw some hot water, cold water on the legislation.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what you were saying, Environmental Improvement Board is a group that is appointed by the current administration. They are not a group of technical experts per se. And so obviously, with any sort of board and commission that's appointed by the governor, it is impossible not to say that politics comes into play at some point.
All right. Well, we've got a few other bills to talk about, unfortunately. HB 30. Now, again, I think this one may not be germane or have been deemed germane, but this is the recycled water in all oil and gas operations. Now, I'll say at the outset that recycling water produced in the oil and gas industry from underground is something that's exciting to me. I think it's seems to have great potential, but the idea of using exclusively recycled water in the fracking process just is not ready for prime time at this point. Talk about this issue and set me straight if I'm wrong with anything.
Yeah, I think just to give a quick overview in general for those who are keeping score and watching in the session, HB 133, which we talked about, is the all encompassing Oil and Gas Act reform bill that we talked about a little while ago. And then there were three separate bills that were introduced by Representative Sarniana, who is a progressive Democrat, in HB 30, 31, and 32. All three of those bills are talking about the same issues that have been grouped into HB 133, but frankly, the Sarniana bills take them a step further to the point where they are completely unworkable from the standpoint of industry, and I would argue their intention is to be put into place to take industry out of business. But regardless, in terms of freshwater, you are correct. What has happened in the last 10 years in the industry has been phenomenal in terms of developing and using recycled water in oil and gas operations. And the very limited amounts of fresh water, relatively speaking, that are being used right now are for drilling when you go through aquifers. You want to have fresh water involved in the drilling process to protect those underground aquifers. It's a necessity. So when a bill comes along and says use 100% recycled water, it actually has the potential adverse effect of being less environmentally friendly. The other thing that completely is dependent upon drilling and use of water is geology. What's going on down in the Permian Basin is a lot different what's going on up the San Juan Basin. So if, let's say, this bill were to go into place and 100% recycled water had to be used, which is frankly still not possible, um, the freshwater sources that are readily available and used in limited quantities in the San Juan Basin would be banned. And what would happen is operators would have to truck in produced water to their sites to actually use them to do the drilling. And from the standpoint of moving around produced water, that frankly creates more potential exposure to environmental potential exposure. So from that standpoint, it just doesn't make logical sense without further looking into the issue and what is feasible and what's not. So yes, strongly stand in opposition of this bill and 31 and 32, all of which we've talked about. One deals with setbacks, and then the other one deals with other aspects of this larger encompassing reform bill.
All right. And so HB 48 is a bill to increase royalties on the oil and gas industry. Royalty just being a fancy name for a tax increase. Seems to me that the old line, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered, might come into play here. You know, the state of New Mexico has never seen a better day in terms of economic growth thanks to the oil and gas industry. By growth, I don't mean the overall economic numbers, but the budget growth, the opportunity. It's been largely mismanaged, and that's my own comments, not yours, but it's been wasted in ways that I think are highly unfortunate. But the industry has done more for New Mexico's budget than any other industry at any other time in the state of New Mexico. and yet they want more, or at least some do. So, talk about royalties. That I know it's a pretty straightforward issue, but
Yeah,
what?
it is a straightforward issue, but it's also nuanced as well. And you certainly make good points. Across the board, the billions that oil and gas is bringing in, royalties in particular on state lands, go to the state land office, which is a separate entity outside of the administration purview. And those royalties that are generated are then distributed back to 17 different beneficiaries across the state, like New Mexico School for the Blind, New Mexico Military Institute, other entities. And so it's definitely a good thing from that perspective. Our current top royalty rate is 20% on state lands here in New Mexico, and they're making that money off of these very, very profitable leases that are held by the state land office. The state land office is trying to push through a bill, this one that we're talking about, royalty increases, that would increase that top tier from 20% to 25%. And to give you some context, most states' royalty rates are between 16 to 18%, and we're already at 20. Now, there is an argument that they are using, which is true. The state of Texas has a 25% royalty rate. So why shouldn't New Mexico have that? Well, there's really a strong reason for that. Recent study by New Mexico Tax Research Institute has shown that if you look at the overall cost, including taxes and royalties to operators, New Mexico, for our small producers, is the most expensive state to do business in when you are adding up all of the various taxes and the royalties that are involved. So the argument here is that an increase from 20 to 25% is going to have a much bigger impact again on the smaller producers, and it will just add to that giant tax load and royalty load that everyone carries on a per well basis. So that's why we are opposed to this bill. I want to make it clear we're not opposed to money going towards very worthwhile beneficiaries, in this case, where royalties go to. However, again, this just takes it a step too far and has the detrimental impact of hurting disproportionately the smaller operators who will have to pay for that.
Yeah, all of those are excellent points, and it it seems shocking to me that you would go and increase taxes, especially given what you just said. I would imagine that the gross receipts tax, which we often rail about here at the Rio Grande Foundation and on this show, is one of the leading tax differentials between New Mexico and other states. But I'm sure there's a lot more to
Yeah,
it
I
than
mean,
that
and
too.
that's for sure. That's just for starters. New Mexico and its oil and gas operations has a list of different taxes that come out of every barrel produced. Severance taxes, reclamation fund taxes, ad valorem equipment taxes, etc. So you're seeing a conglomeration that really sort of is hurting a death by a thousand cuts, if you will. And then, of course, on top of that is the GRT, which I agree is very problematic in New Mexico.
Just as a general principle, it is always interesting when it comes to the oil and gas industry that, and the environmental impacts of it, that the people who are most quote unquote concerned about that are generally in the Rio Grande corridor, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces. No oil and gas really in any of those areas of our state, but the people who support the industry the most and want to see activities continue and grow are in the Four Corners and in southeastern New Mexico. Now there are other places in the state, and it's kind of mixed as on a case by case basis. But the people who are comfortable with the industry and live around it uh, support the industry. It's just an interesting dynamic here in New Mexico.
Yeah, certainly. I think that is a continued challenge for us as promoters of the industry, to get the word out and educate not only the legislators who we try to bring down into those areas and show them the communities and the comfort and really the welcomeness that we have to live, work, and operate in those areas, but also to the public at large, especially in those more populous zones of Albuquerque, Santa Fe. And you're exactly right. It is a challenge in those urban areas to get the word across to the public to help elect very level-headed political leaders who have that full holistic view of what oil and gas does and the benefits it brings.
All right, just a couple more things to talk about before we let you go, and I really appreciate again you're taking time out of
Sure,
all the
sure.
testimony and whatnot. But as somebody who advocates for the use of the surpluses that we have available to more broadly reform New Mexico's economic structure and tax code, and really use those dollars generated to make New Mexico a more prosperous state, you constantly hear this refrain, including from state analysts, that, oh, the revenue picture is going to drop in coming years, and that the industry, they seem to be predicting the death, or at least the very significant limitations coming for the oil and gas industry. You can't continue to grow the government and generate $3.5 billion surpluses every single year. And there may be price drops or a recession or something, but can you just address the issue of that this industry is somehow facing a imminent decline for us?
Sure. This is discouraging a topic because the reason, if there is any reason for the forecasted quote unquote declines, is because we're working, at least we being our opponents, are working to regulate oil and gas out of business. When it would make the argument that we are at a place here where we are extracting and being environmentally sensitive and producing clean oil and gas better now than we ever have. We have this potential to continue to see it grow if we, being the legislators and the political leaders, had the will to do so. The Permian Basin that we're sitting on right now is the most prolific basin in the world, and I think some estimates indicate that maybe 10 to 20% of the reserves there have been extracted. So we've got 100 years more worth of oil there. And it's not even the regulators that are leading the charge to make it cleaner and more efficient and environmentally safe. It's actually the industry itself. So I think we have the ability, if we go all in on this, to continue to maintain this prosperous in human flourishing industry that is out there. It is this forced transition that, again, I would argue is misguided. That is what's doing the most damage right now. The onus is partly on industry to make sure that we talk more about all the positive benefits and all the positive things that we are doing to change this tide of public sentiment. But as far as forecasts right now that are indicating or showing that there will be some sort of a quote unquote decline, that decline right now is simply being shown that way because there is an anticipation that the regulations are going to get stricter and stricter, and that we're going to prematurely cripple an industry that could still be flourishing for 100 more years, frankly. So
Exactly. And finally, just recently, I believe it was last Friday, the Biden administration put a moratorium on essentially permitting and expansion of liquefied natural gas export terminals. Now, if folks haven't followed this issue, and I commend them to look for I believe it's the Energy Information Administration chart showing the incredible growth in LNG exports. You talk about trade deficits, you talk about flows into the United States, there's foreign policy implications. Uh, I know there's a big immigration battle going on between the Biden administration and the state of Texas, which is one of the primary, of course, they're number one oil producing and gas producing. I believe gas producing, they're definitely oil producing. But anyway,
both,
uh,
yeah.
yeah. So New Mexico's number 2 on oil, not quite as high on the list of natural gas, but this is negative for the industry, for our country, for the environment, for foreign policy. I mean, you know, it just baffles me to watch, especially this federal administration in place and the positions they've taken on various issues. But LNG exports, I don't know how much they impact New Mexico aside from just the broader natural gas market and making sure we have additional markets for New Mexico produced natural gas. But uh, this administration and its policies, broadly speaking, just perplex me to no end.
Yeah, so liquefied natural gas is a market that is growing, and I fear that with what the president is looking to do once again is to choke it off. And I would argue that's a discompassionate maneuver because frankly, what we are doing here in the United States by exporting liquefied natural gas is providing a cheap, reliable, and clean source of energy to different parts of the world that otherwise would be looking to get it from, let's be frank, very dirty sources, say Russia and China. So I think it's discompassionate in not looking out for the welfare of our fellow mankind across the globe. As to the motives behind it, boy, I'll tell you, again, I think it just goes to the influence of the environmental community. They outspend industry 20 to 1.
Jim? Oh, let's see here. I mean, we really don't have.
I'm here. I'm back again. It just froze for some reason.
Okay. So they outspend. You were in the middle of saying that the environmental groups outspend oil and gas 20 to 1. So just conclude that point.
Sure. Yeah. So again, I can't really definitively say what the reasoning is from a rational perspective as to why we would choke off LNG to different companies. But I think we can look and follow the money and see that if we follow the money as to where the influence is in DC, it's those environmental groups that are outspending industry to kill oil and gas because it's oil and gas. So from that standpoint, it's disappointing when that sort of irrationality it creeps into politics in the world in DC, but that's the world we live in, right?
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you, Jim. Is there something you want people to do in New Mexico to help out with defending this industry? Can they affiliate with you or your group or get signed up to your email list?
Yeah, certainly. I think if they want to go to ipanm.org, we do have a newsletter there, and we put up news information that is relevant to small producers in particular. Certainly, we welcome any public comment during the bill hearings in support of the small producers. And with that, just continued word of mouth from door to door. When people are so quick to demonize our industry, it's always best to tell them, look, take a step back and think about the big picture and what we do and what we provide for all New Mexicans.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate your time and good luck in committee.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Paul.
All right. Take care. Bye. This has been the Tipping Point, New Mexico. Sorry, I lost my notes. I was so engrossed there. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.